Welcome to Wonderslate. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for more updates. Topic for today's video is the age of industrialization. This chapter included before the Industrial Revolution, the coming up of the factory, the pace of industrial change, hand labor and steam power, life of the workers, industrialization in the colonies, the age of Indian textiles, what happened to weavers, Manchester comes to India, and factories come up, the early entrepreneurs, where did the workers come from, the peculiarities of industrial growth, small-scale industries predominate and market for goods. Before the Industrial Revolution, all too often we associate industrialization with the growth of factory industry. In the 17th and 18th centuries, merchants from the towns in Europe began moving to the countryside, supplying money to peasants and artisans, persuading them to produce for an international market. With the expansion of world trade and the acquisition of colonies in different parts of the world, the demand for goods began growing. But merchants could not expand production within towns. This was because here urban crafts and trade guilds were powerful. In the countryside, poor peasants and artisans began working for merchants. This was a time when open fields were disappearing and commons were being enclosed. Cottagers and poor peasants who had earlier depended on common lands for their survival, gathering their firewood, berries, vegetables, hay and straw, had to now look for alternative sources of income. Many had tiny plots of land which could not provide work for all members of the household. So when merchants came around and offered advances to produce goods for them, peasant households eagerly agreed. The coming up of the factory. The earliest factories in England came up by the 1730, but it was only in the late 18th century that the number of factories multiplied. The first symbol of the new era was cotton. Its production boomed in the late 19th century. In 1760, Britain was importing 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton to feed its cotton industry. By 1787, this import soared to 22 million pounds. In the early 19th century, factories increasingly became an intimate part of the English landscape. So visible were the imposing new mills, so magical seemed to be the power of new technology, that contemporaries were dazzled. They concentrated their attention on the mills, almost forgetting the by-lanes and the workshops where production still continued. The pace of industrial change. The most dynamic industries in Britain were clearly cotton and metals. Growing at a rapid pace, cotton was the leading sector in the first phase of industrialization up to the 1840. After that, the iron and steel industry led the way. With the expansion of railways, in England from the 1840 and in the colonies from the 1860, the demand for iron and steel increased rapidly. By 1873, Britain was exporting iron and steel. The new industries could not easily displace traditional industries. Even at the end of the 19th century, less than 20% of the total workforce was employed in technologically advanced industrial sectors. The pace of change in the traditional industries was not set by steam-powered cotton or metal industries, but they did not remain entirely stagnant either. Seemingly ordinary and small innovations were the basis of growth in many non-mechanized sectors such as food processing, building, pottery, glasswork, tanning, furniture making, and production of implements. Technological changes occurred slowly. They did not spread dramatically across the industrial landscape. New technology was expensive and merchants and industrialists were cautious about using it. The machines often broke down and repair was costly. They were not as effective as their inventors and manufacturers claimed. Hand labor and steam power. In Victorian Britain there was no shortage of human labor. Poor peasants and vagrants moved to the cities in large numbers in search of jobs, waiting for work. In many industries the demand for labor was seasonal. Gasworks and breweries were especially busy through the cold months, so they needed more workers to meet their peak demand. Bookbinders and printers, catering to Christmas demand, Two needed extra hands before December. At the waterfront, winter was the time that ships were repaired and spruced up. In all such industries where production fluctuated with the season, industrialists usually preferred hand labor, employing workers for the season. In Victorian Britain, the upper classes, the aristocrats and the bourgeoisie preferred things produced by hand. Handmade products came to symbolize refinement and class. They were better finished, individually produced, and carefully designed. Machine-made goods were for export to the colonies. In countries with labor shortage, industrialists were keen on using mechanical power so that the need for human labor can be minimized. This was the case in 19th century America. Britain, however, had no problem hiring human hands. Life of the workers. The abundance of labor in the market affected the lives of workers. As news of possible jobs traveled to the countryside, hundreds tramped to the cities. The actual possibility of getting a job depended on existing networks of friendship and kin relations. Seasonality of work in many industries meant prolonged periods without work. After the busy season was over, the poor were on the streets again. Some returned to the countryside after the winter, when the demand for labor in the rural areas opened up in places. Wages increased somewhat in the early 19th century. But they tell us little about the welfare of the workers. The average figures hide the variations between trades and the fluctuations from year to year. For instance, when prices rose sharply during the prolonged Napoleonic War, the real value of what the workers earned fell significantly, since the same wages could now buy fewer things. The fear of unemployment made workers hostile to the introduction of new technology. When the spinning jenny was introduced in the woolen industry, women who survived on hand spinning began attacking the new machines. This conflict over the introduction of the jenny continued for a long time. Industrialization in the colonies. The age of Indian textiles. Before the age of machine industries, silk and cotton goods from India dominated the international market in textiles. Coarser cottons were produced in many countries, but the finer varieties often came from India. Armenian and Persian merchants took the goods from Punjab to Afghanistan, Eastern Persia and Central Asia. A variety of Indian merchants and bankers were involved in this network of export trade, financing production, carrying goods and supplying exporters. Supply merchants linked the port towns to the inland regions. They gave advances to weavers, procured their woven cloth from weaving villages, and carried the supply to the ports. By the 1750s, this network, controlled by Indian merchants, was breaking down. The European companies gradually gained power, first securing a variety of concessions from local courts, then the monopoly rights to trade. This resulted in a decline of the old ports of Surat and Hooghly through which local merchants had operated. Exports from these ports fell dramatically, the credit that had financed the earlier trade began drying up, and the local bankers slowly went bankrupt. While Surat and Hooghly decayed, Bombay and Calcutta grew. This shift from the old ports to the new ones was an indicator of the growth of colonial power. Trade through the new ports came to be controlled by European companies, and was carried in European ships. While many of the old trading houses collapsed, those that wanted to survive had to now operate within a network shaped by European trading companies. What happened to weavers? The consolidation of East India Company power after the 1760 did not initially lead to a decline in textile exports from India. British cotton industries had not yet expanded and Indian fine textiles were in great demand in Europe. So the company was keen on expanding textile exports from India. Before establishing political power in Bengal and Carnatic in the 1760 and 1770, the East India Company had found it difficult to ensure a regular supply of goods for export. The French, Dutch, Portuguese as well as the local traders competed in the market to secure woven cloth. So the weaver and supply merchants could bargain and try selling the produce to the best buyer. However, Once the East India Company established political power, it could assert a monopoly right to trade. It proceeded to develop a system of management and control that would eliminate competition, control costs, and ensure regular supplies of cotton and silk goods. First, the company tried to eliminate the existing traders and brokers connected with the cloth trade, and establish a more direct control over the weaver. It appointed a paid servant called the Gomasta to supervise weavers, collect supplies, and examine the quality of cloth. Second, it prevented company weavers from dealing with other buyers. One way of doing this was through the system of advances. Once an order was placed, the weavers were given loans to purchase the raw material for their production. Those who took loans had to hand over the cloth they produced to the Gomasta. Manchester comes to India. In 1772, Henry Patullo, a company official, had ventured to say that the demand for Indian textiles could never reduce, since no other nation produced goods of the same quality. Yet by the beginning of the 19th century we see the beginning of a long decline of textile exports from India. Why did this happen? What were its implications? As cotton industries developed in England, industrial groups began worrying about imports from other countries. They pressurized the government to impose import duties on cotton textiles so that Manchester goods could sell in Britain without facing any competition from outside. Cotton weavers in India thus faced two problems at the same time. Their export market collapsed, and the local market shrank, being glutted with Manchester imports. Produced by machines at lower costs, the imported cotton goods were so cheap that weavers could not easily compete with them. Civil war broke out and cotton supplies from the US were cut off. Britain turned to India. As raw cotton exports from India increased, the price of raw cotton shot up. Weavers in India were starved of supplies and forced to buy raw cotton at exorbitant prices. In this situation, weaving could not pay. Then, by the end of the 19th century, weavers and other craftspeople faced yet another problem. Factories in India began production, flooding the market with machine goods. Factories come up. The first cotton mill in Bombay came up in 1854 and it went into production 2 years later. The early entrepreneurs, industries were set up in different regions by varying sorts of people. The history of many business groups goes back to trade with China. From the late 18th century, as you have read in your book last year, the British in India began exporting opium to China and took tea from China to England. Many Indians became junior players in this trade, providing finance, procuring supplies, and shipping consignments. In Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore made his fortune in the China trade before he turned to industrial investment, setting up 6 joint stock companies in the 1830 and 1840. Tagore's enterprises sank along with those of others in the wider business crises of the 1840, but later in the 19th century many of the China traders became successful industrialists. In Bombay, Parsis like Dinshaw Petty and Jamsetji Nusirwanji Tata, who built huge industrial empires in India, accumulated their initial wealth partly from exports to China, and partly from raw cotton shipments to England. As colonial control over Indian trade tightened, the space within which Indian merchants could function became increasingly limited. They were barred from trading with Europe in manufactured goods, and had to export mostly raw materials and food grains, raw cotton, opium, wheat and indigo required by the British. Till the First World War, European managing agencies in fact controlled a large sector of Indian industries. 3 of the biggest ones were Bird Hagelers and Company, Andrew Yule, and Jardine Skinner and Company. These agencies mobilized capital, set up joint stock companies and managed them. In most instances, Indian financiers provided the capital while the European agencies made all investment and business decisions. Where did the workers come from? Factories needed workers. With the expansion of factories, this demand increased. In 1901, there were 5,84,000 workers in Indian factories. By 1946, the number was over 2,436,000. In most industrial regions, workers came from the districts around. Peasants and artisans who found no work in the village went to the industrial centers in search of work. Over 50% workers in the Bombay cotton industries in 1911 came from the neighbouring district of Ratnagiri, while the mills of Kanpur got most of their textile hands from the villages within the district of Kanpur. Getting jobs was always difficult, even when mills multiplied and the demand for workers increased. The numbers seeking work were always more than the jobs available. Entry into the mills was also restricted. Industrialists usually employed a jobber to get new recruits. Very often the jobber was an old and trusted worker. He got people from his village, ensured them jobs, helped them settle in the city and provided them money in times of crisis. The peculiarities of industrial growth. European managing agencies, which dominated industrial production in India, were interested in certain kinds of products. They established tea and coffee plantations, acquiring land at cheap rates from the colonial government, and they invested in mining, indigo and jute. When Indian businessmen began setting up industries in the late 19th century, they avoided competing with Manchester goods in the Indian market. By the first decade of the 20th century, a series of changes affected the pattern of industrialization. As the Swadeshi movement gathered momentum, nationalists mobilized people to boycott foreign cloth. Industrial groups organized themselves to protect their collective interests, pressurizing the government to increase tariff protection and grant other concessions. Yet, till the First World War, industrial growth was slow. The war created a dramatically new situation. With British mills busy with war production to meet the needs of the army, Manchester imports into India declined. Small-scale industries predominate. While factory industries grew steadily after the war, large industries formed only a small segment of the economy. Most of them, about 67% in 1911, were located in Bengal and Bombay. In fact, in some instances, handicrafts production actually expanded in the 20th century. While cheap machine-made thread wiped out the spinning industry in the 19th century, the weavers survived, despite problems. In the 20th century, handloom cloth production expanded steadily, almost trebling between 1900 and 1940. How did this happen? This was partly because of technological changes. Handicrafts people adopt new technology if that helps them improve production without excessively pushing up costs. So, by the second decade of the 20th century, we find weavers using looms with a fly shuttle. This increased productivity per worker, speeded up production and reduced labor demand. The demand for the finer varieties bought by the well-to-do was more stable. The rich could buy these even when the poor starved. Weavers and other craftspeople who continued to expand production through the 20th century did not necessarily prosper. They lived hard lives and worked long hours. Very often the entire household, including all the women and children, had to work at various stages of the production process. But they were not simply remnants of past times in the age of factories. Their life and labor was integral to the process of industrialization. Market for goods. We have seen how British manufacturers attempted to take over the Indian market, and how Indian weavers and craftsmen, traders and industrialists resisted colonial controls, demanded tariff protection, created their own spaces, and tried to extend the market for their produce. But when new products are produced, people have to be persuaded to buy them. They have to feel like using the product. How was this done? One way in which new consumers are created is through advertisements. As you know, advertisements make products appear desirable and necessary. They try to shape the minds of people and create new needs. Today we live in a world where advertisements surround us. They appear in newspapers, magazines, hoardings, street walls, television screens. When Manchester industrialists began selling cloth in India, They put labels on the cloth bundles. The label was needed to make the place of manufacture and the name of the company familiar to the buyer. The label was also to be a mark of quality. When buyers saw "Made in Manchester" written in bold on the label, they were expected to feel confident about buying the cloth. Images of Indian gods and goddesses regularly appeared on these labels. It was as if the association with gods gave divine approval to the goods being sold. The imprinted image of Krishna or Saraswati was also intended to make the manufacture from a foreign land appear somewhat familiar to Indian people. We are discussed the age of industrialization. Before the Industrial Revolution, all industrialization with the growth of factory industry. In the 17th and 18th centuries, merchants from the towns in Europe, the expansion of world trade and the acquisition of colonies in different parts of the world. In the countryside, poor peasants and artisans began working for merchants. And the coming up of the factory. The earliest factories in England came up by the 1730. The first symbol of the new era was cotton. Its production boomed in the late 19th century. In the early 19th century, factories increasingly became an intimate part of the English landscape. The pace of industrial change. The most dynamic industries in Britain were clearly cotton and metals. The expansion of railways, in England from the 1840 and in the colonies from the 1860. The new industries could not easily displace traditional industries. The pace of change in the traditional industries was not set by steam-powered cotton or metal industries. Technological changes occurred slowly. They did not spread dramatically across the industrial landscape. Hand labor and steam power. In Victorian Britain there was no shortage of human labor. In many industries the demand for labor was seasonal. In Victorian Britain, the upper classes, the aristocrats and the bourgeoisie preferred things produced by hand. In countries with labor shortage, industrialists. Life of the workers. The abundance of labor in the market affected the lives of workers. Wages increased somewhat in the early 19th century. The fear of unemployment made workers hostile to the introduction of new technology. Industrialization in the colonies. Indian merchants and bankers were involved in this network of export trade financing production. While Surat and Hooghly decayed, Bombay and Calcutta grew. What happened to weavers? The consolidation of East India Company power after the 1760. The French, Dutch, Portuguese as well as the local traders competed in the market to secure woven cloth. The company tried to eliminate the existing traders and brokers connected with the cloth trade, prevented company weavers from dealing with other buyers. Manchester comes to India. In 1772, Henry Patullo, a company official, had ventured to the demand for Indian textiles could never reduce. As cotton industries developed in England, industrial groups began worrying about imports from other countries. Cotton weavers in India thus faced two problems. Civil war broke out and cotton supplies from the US were cut off. Britain turned to India. Factories come up and the early entrepreneurs, industries were set up in different regions by varying sorts of people. The history of many business groups goes back to trade with China. In Bengal, Dwarkanath Tagore made his fortune in the China trade before he turned to industrial investment. As colonial control over Indian trade tightened. First World War, European managing agencies in fact controlled a large sector of Indian industries. Where did the workers come from? Factories needed workers. In most industrial regions workers came from the districts around. Getting jobs was always difficult, even when mills multiplied and the demand for workers increased. The peculiarities of industrial growth. European managing agencies, which dominated industrial production in India. First decade of the 20th century, a series of changes affected the pattern of industrialization. The First World War, industrial growth was slow. Small-scale industries predominate. And number 160, while factory industries grew steadily after the war. Large industries formed only a small segment of the economy. Handicraftspeople adopt new technology if that helps them improve production without excessively pushing up costs. Weavers and other craftspeople who continued to expand production through the 20th century did not necessarily prosper. Market for goods: how British manufacturers attempted to take over the Indian market, and how Indian weavers and craftsmen, traders, new consumers are created is through advertisements. When Manchester industrialists began selling cloth in India, images of Indian gods and goddesses regularly appeared on these labels. Thank you for watching the video. If you have any suggestion for us, feel free to leave comments. If you liked the video and want to see more of it, hit the thumbs up and don't forget to click on subscribe button to get more updates of the future videos.